Oh, well, this afternoon, Mickey and I are very, very excited because there's lots of interesting stuff going on. Yet again, it never ceases to amaze one how we cannot go a day or two without yet another barrage and another barracking from a certain couple. And this time I have been flooded with questions about my opinion of Harry's podcast. So, if I may just read one of the many, many questions, and this is really very representative. It's from Megan Carter. Have you seen the latest smear Harry has done on his family, Lady C? You are so right. He's going to keep blabbing on about the royals to stay relevant, because without them he is nothing. But his latest insult to the Queen about her parenting, and Philip's and Charles's, it's just too much. Of course, he also insulted how they do business and run things, blah, blah. I mean, it's just too much. When is the Queen going to step in? Something has to be done. It's okay, Nikki, you can go. Can't they make them Mr. and Mrs. already and send out a cease and desist and ban them from smearing them? Would be Megan Carter that life was quite as simple as that, but I fear it is not. I am afraid that the royal family cannot simply muzzle Harry. And in fact, because I got so many questions on this subject, I thought to do everybody justice, I thought I really must actually listen to the podcast in its entirety. It's an hour and a half, and it was very revealing. You know, there's a reason why people should say as little about themselves as possible, because you don't only reveal that which you intend to impart as information, you also reveal that which you do not intend to impart. So you are actually revealing what you intend to conceal. And this I found very interesting. And I would not have actually appreciated the extent to which Harry has unmasked himself, his relationship with his wife's modus operandi. And I mean, he's really confirming an awful lot that people have long suspected, but he doesn't realize it. That's the beauty of it. So, having said that, I will give credit where it is due. If you know nothing about psychology, if you are very naive as to the realities of this world, in terms of privilege and in terms of the duties that are involved with privilege, you'd be suckered. You'd be suckered. Because Harry actually has charm. And when he's not around Meghan, the charm actually comes out really quite strongly. He's always had charm, except when he's around her. Then he is morose and like a Stockholm syndrome victim, staring into space, blinking, looking shifty, sort of allowing her to have the floor, which, of course, fits in very well with their relationship because there's a very Oedipal element to that relationship. And this actually, if you know what you're looking for, comes across in the podcast. Well, if I may take things in a fairly orderly fashion, it's somebody called Dax Shepard, who I confess I had never heard of before. I'm not into popular culture particularly, and I'd never heard of him. Quite frankly, I have better things to do with my time than listen to people spewing forth or claptrap, really. Well, I don't know if Dax Shepard is a mental health expert. Of what I was able to gather, he is not a mental health expert. You know, speaking as somebody who had an extremely troubled childhood and upbringing, and who it has self-evidently overcome all of the difficulties of her youth, all of which were imposed. Uh, I think I'm in a fairly good position to say that I do not regard myself as sufficiently expert to be having or hosting or participating in programs that are going to affect the lives, possibly, of the people who look at the shows. Well, I have an IQ of 154, as well as my past. So if I don't think I'm qualified, I have to question why Dax Shepard, who I gather of what he said, is a 12-stepper, which I think is good. I'm very familiar with the 12-step program. I used to go to Al-Anon when I was married to my ex-husband. I continued going after I left my ex-husband because of the devastation that he wrought in my life. My mother died of alcoholism, so I didn't go for her, but it was certainly useful, and it's been useful ever since then. And I have a great deal of respect for the 12-step program. And so I would say that to an extent, Dax Shepard has some locus, shall we say, but only some. My understanding of the 12-step program is that you are not an expert. You're not supposed to be teaching anybody anything. You're not an authority. You're not setting yourself up as an authority. And okay, Dax Shepard did basically ask questions of Harry. Well, Harry, there were times when he couldn't resist the authoritative stance. He's a very authoritarian personality, incidentally. And there were times when his answers or questions to Dax Shepard were disconcertingly authoritative. Like, he is not only the world's leading expert on mental health, but that Sigmund Freud, Adler, Jung, Theodore Reich, let me think who else. Let's not forget my old friend Erica Freeman. All these eminent people should be going to Harry for lessons. Very disconcerting, that. But I suppose you can take the prince out of the palace, but you can't take the arrogance out of the prince. So let's put it that way. Well, it's quite clear from listening to Harry, the terms that he uses. Anybody who's familiar with therapy will immediately know that he is in full therapeutic mode and therapy speak. Your living experience, blah, 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 da, da, da. One term after another. It would appear from what Harry was saying and how he was saying it that he has had quite a lot of integrative psychotherapy, which is basically a cocktail of styles and a certain amount, or I'd say a good amount, of psychodynamic therapy as well. This invites you to revisit childhood experiences. It asks the client to look back into their upbringing, consider and hopefully find a trauma or two or a lack of attention from their primary caregivers. Or anyway, I suppose really to cut to the chase, it invites you to ferret around in your past and come up with reasons why your present is not perfect. This contrasts rather sharply with cognitive therapy. Cognitive therapy basically says to you, this is the present, you have problems, it doesn't matter how you came by your problems. You can solve your problems in the here and now. I actually am inclined to think that a more productive way of overcoming problems, and now I'm speaking as someone who had really serious problems. I don't think there are many people in this world who were born into one sex and brought up in another, who were hospitalized at the age of 13, given insulin shock treatments, shot up with hormones of the opposite sex, who was condemned for the next 7 years, certainly 4 entirely, and then 3 thereafter, to live a half life, who had a father who was really pretty disturbed, and a mother who was not only an alcoholic, but the supreme narcissist. So I think I'm pretty qualified sitting here, hale, hearty, healthy, and happy, and having made a success of my life with very little help from loved ones, in quotes, and indeed a very great deal of hindrance. I do not think it behooves you to wallow in the past, to use your past as an excuse for adopting a posture of victimhood, which is what Harry does. Nobody who is a genuine victim, and I do speak as somebody who was a genuine victim of a terrible, terrible accident of nature. I've never met anybody who was born with a handicap or developed a handicap who wallowed in self-pity. It is one of the most destructive things you can do. Now, Harry, I hate to say, wallows in self-pity. He is riven with self-pity. Of course, the podcast is basically merching again, and he is merching the supposed failings of his past and his misery and how miserable he was. But it is a bold financial arrangement. Dax Shepard is moving to Spotify. So Harry is brought on to by Spotify, obviously, to boost up Dax Shepard's profile. I'm sure I'm not unique in being one of the only people in the world who'd never heard of Dax Shepard and has now heard of him. Also, they got in several plugs for his mental health series with Oprah, which they took great pains to tell us on several occasions is airing on the 21st of May. Well, very interesting, all of that. But, big but, what qualifies Harry or Oprah to be speaking about mental health subjects and to be lecturing us on mental health subjects and to be interviewing people on mental health subjects and to be exchanging their personal experiences in such a way that you actually have to question what the purpose of it, because I've got news for Harry and Oprah and even Dax Shepard. People's suffering is not for entertainment. It's not a matter of entertainment. So now I will, if I may, I will plunge right in, after rather a long preamble, if I may say so myself, to some of the matters that he covered. Harry starts out by making the point that if you have a platform, you should be responsible for what you say, and then proceeds to completely disregard the fact that he is responsible for what he's saying, and he might be leading people down the garden path. And I have to tell you, he does lead people down the garden path, because he even more than Dax Shepard, but Dax Shepard also somewhat lays the blame for their drinking and drug taking on their childhood traumas. Now, Dax Shepard has, it would appear, had quite a traumatic past. Harry has had a much less traumatic past. I know Harry's things because he's very self-centered and very spoilt and very obtuse. So he is completely focused on his suffering and being a drama queen and the product of a drama queen. He actually thinks that his suffering is more acute than anybody else's. This is not, I've got to tell you, a unique phenomenon. It comes with spoilt brat territory. And very often it comes with people who are so selfish, so self-centered, that they can't see the wood for the trees. But I've got news for both Dax Shepard and for Harry. There is absolutely no proof whatsoever that alcoholism and drug addiction bear an absolute relationship to trauma. There's no proof whatsoever. And I would go further than that and say, my mother died of alcoholism, so I can personally speak on this subject. My mother didn't have any traumas when she was growing up. My sisters, my brother and I, we had traumas, and not one of us hit the bottle, nor did one of us resort to drugs. Nobody knows what causes drug addiction or alcoholism. It is likely that drug addiction and alcoholism are manifestations of low-grade personality disorders or genetic issues. There's the possibility that these conditions have a genetic predisposition. There's a possibility, discomforting as it is, that they even have a physical component. Because, for instance, psychopaths usually have deformed amygdalas. So there is the possibility that there is a physical component to this as well. The point I'm trying to make is a very simple one. Nobody knows what causes alcoholism or drug addiction. There are many alcoholics and drug addicts, and I count my Aunt Marjorie and my mother amongst them, who had very happy childhoods, no problems, were very privileged, maybe too privileged, and one sister ended up an alcoholic and the other ended up a drug addict. Sorry, nothing to do with trauma. Yet both Dax Shepard and Harry are trying to blame their drinking and drug taking on their traumas. It doesn't wash, and it's dangerous, because alcoholics and drug addicts who don't have traumas will be going ferreting for traumas, or think, oh well, this doesn't apply to me, no point even trying. You see where it's dangerous. A little knowledge can be a very dangerous thing, as the famous adage says. Harry has various obsessions which come out loud and clear. He touches upon very early on about advertising algorithms, that they affect people's feelings and prejudices, and Harry seems to think that everybody is as dumb, as malleable, and as ready to swallow rubbish as he is. I mean, he's definitely swallowing rubbish, because by his own admission, in his early 20s, he did not particularly want to be royal, but he saw, and this, I have to tell you, was the only time in the whole of that interview that I thought he had a truly lucid, healthy, mature, life-enhancing moment. Because he didn't particularly want to be royal. He was rebelling against the constraints and constrictions, which many people do. And if I may divert for a second, he doesn't seem to understand that the person who works at Target, the person who works in a supermarket, the engineer who is bored, the computer technician who'd really much rather be on a beach in Hawaii, he doesn't seem to understand that most people work because they have to, and that the lucky few are the ones who really enjoy their work. He seems to think that because he was overprivileged, any demands that were made upon him that he did not wish to satisfy were the burdens of privilege. And if he gets rid of the shackles of privilege, he can do what he wants, and he's joined the real world and real people. He doesn't seem to understand that the real world is full of real people who actually work because they have to. They don't like their jobs necessarily. They'd much rather not have their jobs, but they have to work. He doesn't get it. I mean, the lack of insight into the ordinary lives of people is beyond belief. So he is in his 20s. He's got this Damascene moment where he figures out if he makes something of his role and tries to do things he likes within it, that he will make a difference to humanity, possibly, but that he will be doing his job well, that he didn't choose his role. He doesn't seem to understand that working class people didn't choose to be born working class. Middle class people didn't choose to be born middle class. Upper class people didn't choose to be born upper class. What makes him think he's the only person on earth who has had a fate imposed? I mean, the guy is so dumb, it's unbelievable. So entitled, so spoilt. He doesn't realize at the very moment that he's posturing what he's actually saying. I mean, for goodness sake, if you're a prince, yes, you can't do exactly what you want all the time. But don't then say, oh, all you hundreds of millions of people out there who I'm going to uplift and elevate, and I'm going to change your lives, and I'm going to inspire you, because I have given up being a prince, and I have given up the constraints of royalty to hawk my wares, make a whole load of money, appear on television constantly, telling people how unfortunate I am and how much I have suffered. Count your blessings, Harry, count your blessings. Yeah, you lost your mother when you were 12. Quite frankly, Harry, that doesn't stack up well beside a 5-year-old child in Egypt who has to be selling trinkets to tourists. It doesn't stack up well between the average poor person anywhere in the world. It doesn't even stack up well with people who were born into privileged backgrounds and had other problems. And I count myself in that number. So if I'm not bleating for sympathy, and actually consider myself very lucky because I was able to overcome my problems, Well, why aren't you beating the drum of how lucky you are? Why are you beating the drum of how unlucky you are? I'll tell you why he's doing it. And this comes out loud and clear. Because he is utterly self-centered. He is totally self-indulgent. He truly believes that he is so special that his perfectly ordinary functions and experiences are unique. But on the other hand, he then spins around and says, very contradictorily, he just wants to be an ordinary person. And his idea of being an ordinary person is going on television and moaning and groaning about the pains of privilege. He, as we all know, and I gather that there is tremendous upset at the palace about this, that he effectively berated the method of his upbringing, his father's method, his grandparents' method of bringing them up. But he doesn't berate his mother's method of bringing them up. You know why? Because Diana did not discipline those children enough. The royals disciplined those children. Harry gives the game away without even realizing it when he says things like, pretty much all his life he's been told that there's something wrong with him and he needs to do something about it. And he denied, like most people who are somewhat disordered and have real mental health problems, that there was nothing wrong with him. Meghan is the one who made him realize that there was something wrong with him by getting him in touch with his pain because of his rage. He denies, incidentally, raising his voice or giving a vent to his anger, but admits he was angry. Well, I know that that's not true, because I know people who know Harry very well, and I know people whose children have known Harry very well since he was a little boy. And Harry always had a big problem with rage. And Harry has always been angry. And there is also a school of thought, in case Harry doesn't know it, that some people are born angrier than others. Harry seems to think that love is the natural way and that hatred is totally unnatural and that people are distorted into hatred. Well, that's a very Rousseauian way of thinking, you know, that basically man is a noble beast. Man is not a noble beast. Napoleon used to believe in Rousseau and used to think that man was a noble beast. And he got cured of that illusion when he went to the Middle East and saw the terrible atrocities that people committed with great alacrity and absolutely no compunction against each other. It amazes me that it took him to have to go to the Middle East to figure that out. Because, I mean, I would have thought just being under the guillotine or near the guillotine and seeing what happened in the French Revolution would have been all the elucidation he needed upon that subject, but clearly not. So you see, dreamers will dream, and in defiance of fact. The fact of the matter is, Man is born, and I'm using the old-fashioned terms. I'm 71 years old and I'm really not changing. I'm awfully sorry. Man is what people used to describe humankind until a few years ago. And I'm really not, I'm sorry. I'm not polluting my thought processes by having to jump through linguistic hoops at the same time. So I will continue. Man is born both positive and negative, both loving and hating. Man is born with the capacity for both destructiveness and constructiveness. It is a very dangerous philosophical and psychological premise to think that there is anything accidental about destructiveness and that it only comes about because people have endured pain and suffering. Not true. I used to believe that. My therapist, Basil Panzer, is the one who cured me of that fantastical woolly notion, because I used to genuinely believe that everybody wanted to be good and that when people weren't, it was somehow not their fault and that they had deviated and it was a mistake, and but for blah 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 they would have you know not fallen into the accidental pit. And Basil is the one who cured me of that by pointing out to me. He used to use the Aesop fable, you know, the scorpion stings the frog that's taking it across the river, and the frog says to the scorpion, "Why did you do that? Now we're both going to die." And the scorpion says, "Well, it's in my nature." So it's quite dangerous of Harry to be mouthing off, saying that people only drink and take drugs because they've had pain in their past. Utter rubbish. I remember several people in AA and Al-Anon, because I used to go to AA open meetings as well, make the point that their lives had been full of pleasure and that they loved the high that they got from drinking or drug taking. And it had nothing to do with pain. It was all about pleasure. Harry states that he talks to help people. He's going to share his pain, of course, at $1 million a pop. Let's not forget that he is being paid to do all of this. And he's being paid handsomely to do all of this. So, you know, all this elevation of sharing his pain with the public and into mental health, that it's for the benefit of the people. It's not. Harry, if it was for the benefit of people, you would be in Britain and you would be not marching yourself. You're in Hollywood and you're in Montecito. You're in California to make money. You know, why lie? Why try to deceive people? Just come clean. I mean, people actually much rather their public figures to acknowledge that they have feet of clay. I mean, you're going to go down the route that Ellen DeGeneres has gone down. You know, when you pretend to be something that you're not really, ultimately, you turn people off. Just be yourself. Harry made one or two very interesting admissions that I'm sure he did not realize he was making. The first one is, he says, I always felt that I was different. Drug addicts, alcoholics, and disordered personalities deep down know they're different. They know they're different from they were children because they are different. They're wired differently. That's why they resort to substances, or those who don't resort to substances resort to the opiate of self-delusion, because you can actually convince yourself and you can actually almost bring along a high, and you can do it partly through self-hypnosis, but you can also do it through physical exercise, things like yoga. These release endorphins. So there are ways and means of unhealthy people using healthy techniques to actually hook themselves onto a path that is either destructive or is potentially destructive. He says that it took Megan to enlighten him, and that once he started to go in therapy, things started to fall into place. Well, I'm sure that's true up to a point, and I'm sure that's a good thing up to a point. But it doesn't alter the fact that any shrewd observer, watching his conduct and listening to what he says, has to conclude that Harry is paranoid. He suffers from definite signs of real paranoia. He is overly self-important. He needs to be in control. He doesn't like being out of control. Well, maybe he doesn't like being helpless. But then, how many people do? However, most of us are helpless for many occasions in our lives, and indeed many of us are helpless for most of our lives. Harry could only come up with 3 occasions upon which he felt helpless. And that he's complaining about. And he's complaining about it to people who every day in their lives are out of control of much of what happens to them. But they learn to live with it. And they learn to have positive and happy and productive lives within it. But he's making out that their experience, he's actually invalidating, he's making out that their experience is trivial compared to his experience, notwithstanding the fact that their experience is his 3 times in his life magnified exponentially. He also exhibits an outstanding need to be in control. He said it about 3 times, that he is effectively using therapy so that he can be in control of the outcome of situations. Harry, I don't know what therapist you're going to, but I'm here to tell you that's a misuse of therapy. Good therapists will teach you that you are to be in control of yourself in a situation. You're not to seek to control the outcome of the situation. I have to say, after listening to that, I can understand why Harry's loved ones are basically very concerned about him, because he has not progressed. He thinks he has progressed, but he has digressed. Harry, in his early 20s, when he came to the realization that he had limited control, limited ability to influence his fate and his world, was in a far healthier place than this Harry is, who is seeking to not only influence tens and possibly hundreds of millions of people, but to do so in such a way that he is actually going to profit from it. And not only financially, because a part of his motive, and clearly his wife's motive, is to profit in non-financial ways. Harry is setting himself up to be an authority figure when he's not an authority, to lay claim to demigod status when he's a very flawed human being and not even a very intelligent one at that, to have great knowledge of a subject matter that he clearly has a very limited understanding of. Now, I'm not knocking the work that he has been doing on himself. I wouldn't knock the work that anybody does on himself or herself to lessen the pain of their past. But Harry, you believe too many lies. For instance, he makes out that his mother was more of a victim than she was, and that she was a victim of the royal way. Diana was not a victim of the royal way. Diana was a victim of a troubled childhood. Diana was a victim of eating disorders that run in her family. Harry's problem is that he relishes self-indulgence, relishes attention, relishes wallowing in the great I that he is. I. And thinks that if he relates his occasional pain to everybody else's pain, that somehow means that not only validates his lack of discipline and lack of self-abnegation. He doesn't seem to get it, that the royal way is about self-abnegation. Character Harry is about self-abnegation as well as self-fulfillment. You have chosen one over the other, and you can't. You cannot be self-fulfilled if you are not also self-abnegating. And, he also expects people to buy the lie that they moved to California for their mental health. That's utter rubbish. They moved, as they themselves said in their original statement, they moved to California so that they would be able to make money. Money, money, money. That's what that was all about. But it wasn't totally only about that, because they also, both of them, are supreme egotists who demand that everybody think they are wonderful. And you cannot be as vain and as egotistical, and dare I say it, as narcissistic as both Harry and Meghan are, and play the royal role, because you need to be self-abnegating for that, because it's not about you, it's about what you can do for others. While he is there posturing and posing and pretending to be ordinary at the very moment that he is actually indulging his overinflated ego and presenting himself as everyman. I mean, for somebody who wasn't well educated, notwithstanding the fact that he went to a very good school, but you can lead a horse to water, you can't force it to drink, and he had neither the interest nor the brain power to benefit from his education. He really believes that because he is Prince Harry, Diana's son, with his overinflated ego, and it has to be said, Diana also had an overinflated ego. I mean, she had many virtues, and he has many of her virtues, because both of them have very empathetic streaks in their personality, and both of them have very charming and endearing qualities, but both of them also were very egotistical, very selfish, very, very demanding of attention from others, and hungry for approbation from people. Harry also learned from his mother, and has had the lessons endorsed by his wife. The truth is but clay in the hands of a good sculptress or sculptor, and that it doesn't really matter, because you start out with this blob called truth, and you end up with this thing that you have fashioned, that you call your truth. Diana used to do it. And I know, to those of you who love Diana, that you think she was perfect. She wasn't. She would have been the first one to admit she wasn't. She wouldn't have been willing to admit why she wasn't, but she was very happy to say she was no saint and no angel. Harry, in this interview, comes out with more than one whopper. Now, Harry is obviously the sort of person who lies to himself. It's called self-hypnosis, if you want to be polite. He has this fantasy that he said on more than one occasion about him being free in California. Yes, he's free. He's free to indulge himself without the checks and balances of the institution into which he was born, and which he actually was flourishing very well in until he met Meghan. But he lies. For instance, he says in this podcast that, he can, in California, take his son for a ride on his bike. Something he couldn't do otherwise. Excuse me, Harry, the Americans might not know, but every Brit will know, that when you were living at Frogmore Cottage in Windsor Great Park, you could ride wherever you wanted, and there was no possibility of anybody stopping you or of the paparazzi hounding you. When you're up at Balmoral, you can ride anywhere and they are not going to be able to bother you. When you ride at Sandringham, nobody can bother you. When you ride and rode as well, I should say, because he did all of this as a child with his father, contrary to what he'd like you to believe, that when you rode at Highgrove, you again, nobody would bother you. Nobody did then, nobody would now. So you didn't have to go to California for that. So stop lying to yourself. And if you're not lying to yourself and you really don't, and you really know that what you're saying is rubbish, stop lying to us, because your American admirers might believe you, but no one else does. It's just an outright lie. I will also tell you another thing. Being someone who is a very readily identifiable face in Britain, I speak from personal experience. And I can tell you, Harry is lying to himself, if not to you, when he says that the paparazzi are troubling him, blah, blah, blah. And then he goes in the podcast with, it has to be said, Dax Shepard's encouragement to very pretentiously make out that fame is a terrible burden, being a public figure is an awful thing, that the paparazzi and by extension the public who are going to recognize you are a basic nuisance. And Harry goes on in this podcast about the fact that you should be entitled to your privacy when you're not on the job. People should not be basically allowed to bother you. I mean, the man's deluded. He's nuts. He's an idiot. He's also impertinent. He's not only impertinent to people who would like and admire him, he's also impertinent to God or to nature or to the universe or to good fortune, whatever you want to call it, because Harry, fame and fortune, which you are desperate to increase, so don't lie to me or anybody else and say you're not, otherwise you wouldn't be doing what you're doing. Unless you are a total masochist, you are a complete fraud, because you damn well know, as well as I do, that fame and fortune are blessings and that you love them. What you, however, do not like, because you are too immature, you are too niggardly in terms of your attitude, and in terms of your appreciation of the good fortune and those who help to make your good fortune, because without the public you wouldn't have fame and fortune. You want to bat them away like they're flies and go about your business, and nobody's to look at you. I mean, let's remember, to those of you who don't know it, that Harry and Meghan had the unmitigated gall when they were living at Frogmore Cottage to demand of their neighbours and everybody else surrounding them that nobody was to look at them, nobody was to speak to their dog, nobody was to interact with them unless they interacted. So it's all about what I do, what I want to do, when I want to do it, I'm allowed to do it, and when I don't want to do it, you just need to remember your place and stay in your place. You are there to worship me as and when I want it, and otherwise you've got to be silent. I mean, this is madness. It's arrogance of the highest order. It's not only arrogance of the highest order, it is a form of insanity. It's also incontrovertibly stupid, because, you know, there is no way, unless you are insane or really dumb, that when you are famous, that you can have such an antagonistic view of the public and expect them to do what you want when you want it, and when you don't want it, they're not to do it. So what? The whole of the world exists for your convenience? Because that's really what they're saying, that the whole of the world exists for their convenience. And because people might come up to one, they come up to one and they say nice things. So you're in a supermarket or you're walking on the street and people recognize you and they smile or they look at you. And you're supposed to think that that's an imposition and how dare they, and they shouldn't be doing it. And that if the paparazzi take photographs of you, which you basically want them to do, let's not pretend about it, because this is all egotism run riot. If you aren't getting the photographs that you need to maintain the level of fame that you require, if you don't get that attention, you make sure that you then earn it otherwise. And you are constantly, Harry, doing it. You and Meghan do it 2, 3 and 4 times a week. What all of this boils down to is that you are a spoilt brat who wants to have everything your own way, and everybody else must fall into line and play ball according to your rules in your game. Well, I'm sorry, that's not how the real world works. And you are never going to be somebody who is fit to be listened to unless you grow up, begin to appreciate the blessings that you have. Stop pretending that you are a victim. You are a victim only of your vanity and your egotism and your good fortune and your greed. Your greed. And on that note, I will say thank you very much for listening. I hope this has been of interest to you. If it has, please like, share, subscribe, and press the notification bell. Thank you and goodbye.